Maybe it's broken. Or maybe you actually have a go live button on.
I do have a go live button. Yep.
Okay. There you go.
There we go. All right. It worked.
Yay!
We're good at computers.
With our combined strengths. Yeah.
That's right. It took a Steven and a Steve with a PH and a V to make it happen, but we did it.
You need the both sides of the Steve. Yeah.
Both sides of the Steve. There's the title. Well, hello, everybody, and welcome. My name's Stephen Hackett. I'm the writer at 512 Pixels. I'm joined today by Steve from Mac84. If you follow the vintage Mac space at all, and you're not watching what Steve is doing, I don't know what you're doing, because he has these amazing streams where he dives into Apple history. You do these really long, like I refer to them sort of to my own self as like repair marathons. You streamed for 6 hours yesterday.
Yeah.
So welcome. Why don't you introduce yourself, everybody?
Sure. So I'm Steve. I'm from the Mac84 YouTube channel, or Mac84.net, however you find me. And I'm located here in rainy old New Jersey today. But I'm a lover of all things vintage Apple. I sort of grew up on sipping that Kool-Aid, and I'm sure we'll be discussing a lot of those details. But I am very interested in the history of stuff, and sort of always like to think about, well, how did that work, or why did that happen? And sort of leads you into interesting conversations, and you meet so many cool people like yourself and everyone else in this community who is always so, kind and generous with their time and their information.
Yeah, it really is such a cool community. I've definitely found that to be true over the years as I've gotten more into the hobby and more into collecting in particular. That I've never had an interaction with anybody that feels like, oh, we're competing, or you're doing this thing and I'm going to do something else. Like, we all just want to help each other learn. And in your case, you're doing a lot of work to keep these old machines up and running, which we will get to. But you are a collector. People can see behind you. You have a Molar Mac that's above waist height, which is a miracle.
Yeah.
Mine,
About
I have
60 pounds.
Yeah, it's so heavy. I have a very similar rack, and mine is on the bottom shelf. But how did you kind of start collecting? Where did that start for you?
So my parents got a Macintosh 2CX in the summer of 1990. And so that was our first home computer. My father did graphic design, so he needed something to handle work when he got home and stuff like that. And so he was always someone that would go to yard sales and things like that, and I'd tag along. And I think probably around the mid 1990s, he brought home, or maybe the late 1990s, he brought home a second machine for us to play around with. And it was what he would use for his job. So it was a 7500 that I guess they no longer need at his job. So the Mac 2CI became like the kid's computer. And so instead of just being allowed on the machine from time to time, it was now like, oh, me and my three brothers could go around and play around with this thing, put games on it and whatever. And I was just so intrigued of how it worked. We had Easy Color Paint, which was a drawing program on that. And I love doing little art stuff. And so that was like my gateway to it. And then we had, before that, we even had Macs at school. So I loved the computer lab and everything. So all of that stuff just sort of, I latched onto it because I thought, this is cool. I like how all this stuff works. I understand it to a degree. And whenever I saw things that had the Apple logo on, I'm like, oh, that's a Mac. Even when I saw an Apple II, I didn't know the difference back then. But it sort of ingrained in me. And so later on, when I had some income, I was always looking at yard sales or flea markets because my father liked to do that in some weekends. And there was a big one that was pretty close to us. And the Apple stuff you wouldn't see too often, but when you did, it was like nobody really wanted it. It was sort of neglected. I mean, this you have to think at the time period. This is like the late 90s, early 2000s, where Apple didn't have that bounce back and the success from the iPod and all this stuff. They were still on rocky terrain in some cases. And you could pick up, which I did. I picked up this Mac 512K with the bag, with the image writer printer, keyboard, mouse, accessories. $20. The stipulation was I had to take everything, so I did, and that was one of the first machines I remember getting when I was young. And you know how it is. You get hooked. You get one model, and then, oh wait, there's an accessory that only works with this one, or oh, I didn't see that one before, or why is this one named this and this? And I had no understanding of the model numbers or how they corresponded with each other until much later. But I would be the dork going to the library and say, "Do you have any books by Steve Jobs?" Because I didn't know, if he wrote any books or anything like that. And I'd find like the Mac Secrets like phone book. I think there's one up there, and just like borrow that from the library and read it cover to cover. I wouldn't understand half of it because I was like, what, in grade school? But just finding anything to be talking about Mac stuff really, I think, just pushed me over the edge. And all my friends in school had PCs; they didn't understand. So it
Yeah.
was just sort of this weird thing me and my family had, and it was, I guess collecting things sort of fueled that fire. But I didn't get to that until probably when I had a job, probably, or some income from Christmas and birthdays and stuff like that. Probably until like the very early 2000s or maybe the late 90s. Once in a while we'd go to a yard sale or something like that, and I'd have $20 in my pocket.
Yeah. Well, and it's so much harder now, I think, to get into collecting, or at least it costs so much more. I mean, when you were starting, and even when I started, I think I'm a little bit younger than you, and definitely started later than you with
Hmm.
collecting. Yeah, you could take that $20 in your pocket, and you may walk away with something, pretty impressive. And now, uh, especially now that a lot of that's online,
Hmm.
you see people offering things, and in many cases getting pretty wild money for stuff that 10 or 15 years ago was a fraction of the cost. And
Yeah.
and while that's happening, the things that we're interested in are getting harder to find because more of them are dying, and which as time passes, more of them sort of go away. And it's kind of I think it's a harder hobby to get into now than it used to be, and that makes me sad because I wish more people could enjoy it the way we do.
Yeah, and that is, you hit the nail on the head. It is harder to get into. It's more cost prohibitive to get into. And the thing that people always forget, and I try and remind them every chance I get, is you're looking at this item. Let's say it's on eBay, and let's say it's a few $100s. It might be working now. The guy might show you photos of it working, but unless it has been fully serviced and recapped, preventative maintenance done, and all that stuff, that machine could die tomorrow, and your multi-$100 investment is now poof, it's gone. And so, you have this investment that you made, but all of a sudden now, okay, I have to get it recapped, or I have to figure out what's going on here, because these things are 20, 30, 35 years old. And
Hmm.
so they don't last forever, unfortunately. There's a lot of maintenance that has to go into making these things, you know, stand the test of time. But also, people who are finding this stuff normally aren't the people that are tech savvy about how they work. So
Right.
you'll find somebody on Craigslist who, a relative or a friend passed away, and they have this bucket, or this whole freaking trailer full of Mac stuff, and they're just like, make me an offer. Or sometimes they could, look on eBay and go, well, that one machine, the guy wants $2,000 for it. So this thing, the whole kit and caboodle, that must cost 100 grand easily, and
Hmm.
they'll wonder why they never get, any interest.
Yeah,
And it's
exactly.
it's just so strange, because you'll find somebody with a Mac Classic that's never been opened, probably battery bombed, and they want $100 for it, and they don't have the power cord they claim, and they can't turn it on. And it's like, okay, well, good luck with your sale. And I've unfortunately encountered many individuals, even locally, they'll post a Mac SE or a Mac Classic, and if those machines are reasonably priced under $20, $30, I might pick them up just for parts.
Hmm.
And I'll message them and say, look, I have a keyboard, I have a mouse, I have the disc, I'll come and I'll test it out. And if it works, this is what I'll pay for you. And they're like, no, I need to sell it quick. And you know what? Those listings are still like on Facebook Marketplace a year and a half later. They wanted to
Right.
sell it quick, So
Yeah. So how did you end up going from, one comes home, you're tinkering with it, you're figuring out, you get obsessed like many of us do. But not many people then make the jump to really doing like what you're doing, like component level repair to keep these things moving. I mean, did you have some of that like in your background or your education? How did you even get started with that?
yeah, so that's interesting that you bring that up, because I really had no formal training or education or anything like that. I was always interested in how things work, taking apart things, taking batteries out of stuff. My parents would always yell, "Where's the batteries?" And they'd look at my direction because I'd taken out for a toy or something like that. But I was always interested in how things work and taking things apart, and so that started at an early age. But as far as the component level repair stuff, around 2017, when I started the channel, I was thinking to myself, okay, well, I'm hearing a lot of stuff about replacing capacitors. I have to figure out, how to do this stuff.
Hmm.
And I was looking online, and there were, a bunch of tutorials from PC side of things, not really on the Mac side of things. And it's really when I started reading into these things, I found some great tutorials. My friend Bruce Rain of his YouTube channel is Frank's Creations. He does a lot of soldering videos, and just talking to people like that and learning about things really opened my eyes, because you hear things, oh, all your computers need to have their capacitors replaced. Well, what's a capacitor? Well, why does it have to be replaced? And I always thought, oh, that I don't have to worry about that. That's for people who store their things in an attic or a garage. And I'm like, oh wait, that's me. I have to worry about that. And the leaking PRAM batteries and exploding clock batteries and all that stuff. So yeah, I really just dove in headfirst because I didn't really have an understanding of a lot of this stuff. But by watching a lot of people online and by reading a lot about this, I have a collection of probably over 150, 200 machines at this point in various states. Not all of them work, some are parts, etc.
Sure. Yeah.
But it's like, okay, well, I have to do something, because otherwise all this stuff that I collected is just going to sit here and it's going to get worse and worse and worse.
Mm-hmm.
And, start with the earliest machines, attack those and learn about it. And I haven't even, it was only until like this year that I discharged a CRT. I was very slow to get into like some of the zappy analog bits, but it became very clear to me that there's a very passionate community out there that will gladly tell you how to do these things. And I've always been someone who liked being behind the camera, not really public speaking or anything like that. But when I started playing around with YouTube, it's like, okay, well, I want to tell the story of these things. I want to dive in the history of this stuff. I want to fix this stuff. I guess it has to be me in front of the camera. So I better get used to that, get used to my own voice and all these, things that go on in your head. But
yeah,
I think it turned out okay. I'm having a lot of fun with it. I'm nearly at 10,000 subscribers on YouTube, which is blowing my mind, because I remember when I hit 50 and I was like, yay. So
yeah, no, it's really awesome. I think one thing I'm so impressed with what you're doing is you saw a need, right? You saw, well, I want to learn about this. There's really no place for me to learn. So you sort of put together an education from all these different places. And now in streaming what you're doing and talking about it, you are creating the resource for the next person to come along. And I just think that's super cool. I mean, I think that that's how so many of us learn. Very few of us sort of in this community, like, I didn't go to school for podcasting, like it wasn't a thing, right? You kind of figure it out on your own and then you try to teach others.
And I feel like that is sort of like where you get the best experience from, because you have to learn very rapidly, but you also have to seek out what works best for you. And there's a ton of tutorials and different things of how to do these things differently. I found what works for me, but it's just the case of what you're interested in and exploring that and going from there. And I think with the Macintosh stuff, I have a lot of built-in knowledge from being a bookworm at the library and getting Mac stuff and Mac Addict magazine and talking to my dad and his coworkers and all this stuff. And I sort of take that for granted in a sense, because it's like, oh, well, I know if you hear the death chimes, it's usually a memory issue, or you have to check this or that. And, there's these people that will post on a forum or a community, and, I make an assumption that they may know these things, but obviously they're just new into this, so how could they? And so I really want to strive to put this information out there. No gatekeeping or any of that. It's like, look, you want to enjoy these vintage Macs? Here you go. Here's what I know. Hopefully it helps. I'm not perfect. I'm not right 100% of the time, but that's why I did that vintage Apple Basics video on my channel, because I'm like, look, here's some stuff to get you started with, because there's a lot to dive into with the Mac. The file format of the disks, how to transfer data from back and forth to a machine, capacitor stuff, all these weird things with SCSI and SCSI IDs and dying hard disks. And it's a lot to unpack. I mean, you slowly, absorb it when you're getting into this stuff. But for a newcomer who's like, hey, I just got this Mac, it needs a hard drive, it needs a battery, I need a monitor for it. Where do I start?
Right. Yeah, and so much of that stuff otherwise would just be lost to time, right? I mean, I think about this a lot on the software side. Like, take something like, COBOL programming, right? Like, at some point, the last person who knows how to do that will be gone. And then that's a whole world of knowledge and software that just slowly disappears. And, I've talked about this before on my channel, but there's interplay between hardware history and software history, right? Because the hardware is a vessel for the software, right? Like, at some point, despite all of our best efforts, there won't be much left that can run, System 7. And then how do you even come across it. And even just this past week, someone had a project up where they're doing virtualization of System 7 and Mac OS 8 in the browser, which is really cool. It's a really cool project called Infinite Mac. But there's that interplay there, right? And I wonder, as a historian and someone who's working on this hardware, like, do you think about that sort of thing? Like, what do you think we could be doing to make sure this software lives on to the future?
Yeah, oh, I certainly do. And I'm the type of person who archives everything. I have a archive.org account. I think the username there is Mac84 TV. And every piece of paper I get, every disk I get, every piece of software that I find that's unique, it seems like it has not been archived before. I put it up there because I've been in a situation before where I'm looking for something, I can't find it, and some lovely soul has decided to upload that. And I'm like, thank goodness. And sometimes it's me from the past. I did some video about some video game accessory. I needed some weird driver. Lo and behold, my old Angel Fire page still existed. I was able to download the file from there, like save my own butt.
That's hilarious.
Yeah, it's like a weird Inception type thing. But yeah, I mean, you think about this, the hardware is only going to last so long. And there are lovely projects like the Macintosh SE Reloaded project, where this guy, Kai Robinson, and people have recreated the logic board for Mac SE. And so you need some original components because they don't make them anymore, but there's a lot of trickery going on where people can take like a blue pill or something and recreate it to do logic that is similar to the original chips. But there will become a time when, unfortunately, all these pieces of hardware, or a significant number of them, are gone. So things like virtualization and emulation is, I think, fantastic. I mean, yeah, sometimes it's easier to do something, if you have the hardware in front of you. And emulation, you might have to have everything configured properly for it to work, and not everything works well because, I mean, the classic Mac operating system and the hardware grew hugely for just a 10-year span. You went from 68K to PowerPC and OS 10 afterwards and all this stuff. So, it's much harder from a Mac perspective than it is from a Windows perspective, where it's like, oh, you just get DOS on there or something and
right.
whatever. But the Mac, it's System 6, System 7, 7.5, 8, 8.1, 8.6, and all this stuff. And then, is it 68K, PowerPC, etc. But you have to make sure that if there's an important program to you, or an important piece of software, or even your old like files from when you were a kid or something like that, to preserve that is very important. And to me, it's like that's probably what my big driving force is, because the hardware is great, but the OS is what I interfaced with, and the apps are what I interfaced with. So making sure that the programs that I was around to use are around for the next generation, whether it be emulated within a browser, or let's say someone downloads it from a place like Macintosh Garden and puts it on their Blue SCSI and puts it on a physical Mac, that's great. But as long as that's being shared, I think that's awesome. I think, unfortunately, there's a bit of hesitation from people where they find some old discs, and I'm talking about old floppies or something like that, and they're a little hesitant to archive them. It's like, oh, well, this has a Disney logo on it. I don't know if they'd be too happy about it. I'm like, okay, well, if you put it on archive.org, they have like an exemption, and I don't think you're really going to be personally, accused of anything. Worst case that happens, they take off the disc. But I understand people's hesitation. But a lot of this stuff is bit rotting. It's dying. There's a bunch of Apple II stuff that is still being hunted for because nobody found the disc for it. So I think that's very important to preserve this stuff. And it's very exciting to see web projects to put the Mac OS in a browser, make it easily accessible to anybody, whether you have the physical hardware or not. It's nice to have the hardware, but that's no longer a requirement anymore for most things.
I apologize to the live stream for the clicking. I think my cable for my in-ears was tapping the microphone. I moved it out of the way. Yeah, it sounds like you and I almost come from like different angles at this, where I came to the Mac in high school in about 2001. So I came to the Mac during the OS 10 transition, and I used the classic Mac OS, but not for very long. And for me, the hardware was always like, the hardware is to this day what I'm more interested in. Part of that.
I mean, it's beautiful.
It is. I actually thought about this. I've rearranged my office over the last year, and where my streaming setup is the one wall where there's not old Macs behind me. So I need to maybe move where this is. But it's such a big hobby where you can be interested in both, or one over the other. You said something really interesting that caught my attention, that over that 10-year period, let's say from 90 to 2000, or 89 to 99, how much the Mac grew. And thinking about it, like most of that, I would argue, was on the hardware side because not that Mac OS itself didn't get better in that time frame, but it didn't get better enough, right? That's
Yeah.
what led to the great near collapse of Apple in the late '90s. And I just sometimes I wonder, like, even thinking about like the price of classic Mac hardware and how that skyrocketed over the last decade or so. Like if you had told somebody in 1997, they're like, hey, not only is Apple going to be the most valuable company in the world, all this stuff, but like people are going to be super into these Macs that are for sale now, where a lot of the Mac faithful were like, we want better stuff. And
Yeah.
it's amazing to me how much that shifted and how much success they've seen coming so close to death there for a minute.
Oh yeah, and it's very, very interesting to talk to people who either worked at Apple or worked very closely with those individuals, and you hear all these anecdotes of like, yeah, it's a classic too. We didn't even want to make it or whatever, and people that inside the company were like, we didn't expect people to use this for 5 years, let alone 25 years.
Yeah.
And that migration of 68K code to PowerPC to classic Mac OS to OS 9 and then Mac OS 10 is just a prime example of why it's very important to preserve this type of stuff, because the machines won't be around forever to emulate every flavor of the Macintosh system software. I mean, even though I have a collection of machines behind me, that covers the wide variety of versions of the Mac OS that could be run,
Yeah.
but you're still going to have outliers like, oh, here's a piece of software that was only designed when the 512K Mac was out, and even if it runs on a Mac Plus, it gets a little crazy.
Right.
So
Yeah.
you have to be careful when you think about that stuff. But that's very interesting that you came into the Mac at that stage, because I think at that point in time, Apple's products really had a. I mean, I think the beige ones are beautiful, but everything in the 2000s era just had this lovely design to it.
Yeah.
And I think people who never thought about a computer in that way were sort of forced into thinking that way.
Hmm.
And like, okay, I don't know anything about the Mac, but I want it. And that I experienced that in high school where, I was being a dork and I had a bunch of Apple stickers all over my notebook because what else would I do? And someone was like, oh, can I get a Mac case and put PC parts in there? And I'm like, I guess, but why would you want to? And they were like, well,
Yeah.
because it looks cool. And that's all they cared about. That's all they cared about.
I mean, that was part of their rebound, right? Was we're going to make these things desirable. That was the whole idea of the original iMac, right? The back of our computer looks better than the front of the other guys.
Yep.
Um,
Yeah, I have one hiding up here, I think. Yeah, there it
oh
is.
yeah, yeah, there it is. Um, so let's shift gears a little bit.
Sure.
So we've talked about sort of the classic time frame. I want to shift to now a little bit, and then I have some like lightning round questions to wrap this up. But
Oh boy.
when you think about the next generation of people who are going to be interested in the Mac, people are coming up now. They're coming up in the Tim Cook era. They're coming up, currently in the Apple Silicon transition. Do you think there are decisions Apple is making now that will hinder like collecting and repair in the future? And if you could have them change something to maybe make this hobby more viable in the future, what would it be?
That's a great question. Yeah, I think, coming from someone who has been very hands on with the older hardware, the new stuff is almost alien to me.
Hmm.
It's very, sort of understandable why they're going in directions they are going in. But for example, things being soldered onto logic boards like memory and storage devices and stuff like that, that are serialized with the machine that must be approved by Apple with some internal software to get working. That can be activation locked and stuff like that. And don't get me wrong, all that stuff is great if your machine gets stolen or something like that. But I don't know how many photos I could take seeing like pallets full of iPad Airs and stuff like that are just in physically perfect condition, but they've been sitting in the e-waste place for like a month and they're going to get scrapped because someone forgot the password for it or whatever.
Yeah.
And so I mean that stuff really hurts. I think Apple could really take a better stance. They always say they're environmental and this and that, and that their devices are recyclable and this and that. But I think there has to be some way forward where they could look at the hundreds of thousands of iOS devices, for an example, that they sell because they're a very desirable product. People love the iPhone, they love the iPad,
Hmm.
I do too. But there comes a point where, okay, let's even say if a device was stolen or a device was lost. maybe 10 years later, if there's no personal data on the device or whatever, Apple could send some sort of code to that or wipe it or whatever. Because let's face it, there are schools and institutions out there who would love a learning tool, even if it's not the best one, just to get, their kids engaged in education or in coding or stuff like that. And
Right.
I think anything related to keeping this stuff alive longer would make me happy. The serialization of stuff and the T2 security chip from the Intel era and all this stuff, I understand why they're doing it. I understand from a company perspective, from a privacy perspective, but I think there has to be some middle ground where they have to be sort of more open to people messing around with this stuff after its usable life has been extinguished. Because I think you get into a very strange era of look how green we are. Oh wait, there's a dump truck full of last year's iPads. Don't look at that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I ran into an issue a couple years ago. So several years ago, I did my Mac OS screenshot library. I did all that on real hardware, by the way, on a series of G4 and G5 towers, and then
Nice.
moving to some Intel notebooks. But it's pretty easy to run old versions of Mac OS 10 as long as you have hardware or an emulation stack that supports them. But I was asked by somebody to consider doing the same thing for iOS.
Oh,
and
boy.
I thought, that would actually be pretty cool because there's really very little record of early versions of iOS. A lot of it was because the early versions didn't have screenshot tools, but they eventually added that. But digging into it, I very quickly realized, and it was brought up in the live chat, that things like not signing old releases and in many cases not having them available for download really makes it difficult to do what you and I do with the Mac, to do that for iPhones and iPads.
Sure.
And that bums me out because I think that, I'm not a person who thinks the iPhone and iPad are things that ruined Apple or ruined the Mac. I'm glad they're here. It gives Apple the success that they have. And the Mac has only benefited, especially in recent years, from the gains realized through the iPhone and iPad. But it makes the preservation really pretty difficult on the iOS side. And for that reason, I don't think like what you're doing, I don't think that's ever going to really be able to materialize for people who are super into the iPhone and iPad from a collector standpoint.
Yeah, sure. And the Mac is going to adopt those things. I mean, the Mac Studio, we saw people rip it apart. There's some serviceability there, maybe, but it's like, with the iPad and the iOS stuff like that. I mean, I have an iPad Mini 2 or whatever, and it's so sluggish on the last OS that they pushed to it. And so I would love to revert it back to the original iOS version, but you can't unless you jailbroke it or something like that. Not all devices you could do that to. And even if you're an Apple developer, there's no way to put an original version of the OS that shipped with the device on there, or even an in-between model. And I think that is a way Apple can make an exemption. Look, you're a developer. If it's a personal device that's assigned to you, maybe have it check into your device via USB to do a security check for your account and your Apple ID every 30 days or whatever, but let you run that older version of the iOS, even just for compatibility of checking your apps. I know everything is Xcode and you got those simulators and everything, but in my mind, nothing beats real hardware. And from the preservation side of it, there are apps that I loved or that my nephews have loved to play around with. There's like a Disney animated app that has like a bunch of things from the cartoons, and you could scrub the animation frame by frame and all this cool stuff. It's not available anymore because that whole purge of 64-bit apps is only what's in the App Store. All the 32-bit apps went away. And so just from an archiving standpoint of like, okay, where are the apps? Okay, where's the OS to run on it, the device? Okay, where's the device to actually run those apps? You get into this very muddy situation. And I even saw some tweets from the Internet Archive's Jason Scott about this, and it was a while back, but it looks like they're trying to formulate some sort of plan to do this, but it's like, that would be really cool, but I can't wrap my head around how you would get across that. I sincerely hope that they're successful because it's something that's very important to be preserved. I mean, the first apps that were available in the App Store, probably 90% of them are gone. I mean, I have an iPhone 3G that I plugged in for a day and it finally turned on. And all these apps, Twitterific and all these things that have been long gone. It's like, oh, wow, I remember some of these. And you go to the App Store and they're long gone. They're not even clickable anymore. So I think that's very important from a record of things because it was like the boom of this generational device of the iPhone. And people are sort of letting it get swept under the rug, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned the Mac Studio. I've got one. You've got one.
Yep.
What are your impressions so far? I've been really happy with it.
So, what machine did you leap from to get to the Mac
I didn't
Studio?
go very far. So I had a 2019 Mac Pro.
Okay, all right.
So I went
So,
from a Mac Pro to this.
yeah, so I went. My recent Mac history was a 2006 iMac when that came out, a 2011 iMac, 27-inch when that came out, and when the graphics card failed on that a second time, I got a
Mm,
secondhand 2012 Mac Pro, and I think that was
okay.
around 2018 or so. So I was rocking that for a pretty good time and doing all sorts of unorthodox upgrades like open core and putting a better GPU in there and stuff like that, and an SSD and everything to prolong
Hmm.
its life. And it was running Mojave even though it wasn't supposed to and stuff like
Right.
that. And I got to tell you, I love that machine. It's extremely capable. I love that I could just take the door off and just put in RAM, or I could,
Yeah.
put a USB 3 card in there. Now it has USB 3 and all this stuff.
Hmm.
But when you get into that unsupported era, you have to rely on yourself for tech support, which is fine by me. But it gets in the way when you're trying to be creative and it's like, okay, let me just edit this 4K video from my iPhone. And oh, I can't run the latest version of Final Cut Pro. Okay, well, that's okay. I'll just import the clip anyway. Oh, because I had HDR turned on
Hmm.
the iPhone camera. Now everything is washed out. Oh, I could just update the color profile. Oh, that profile doesn't exist because I'm on such an older version of Final Cut Pro and I
Yeah.
can't update because I'm on Mojave and all these things, So that
Right.
machine is great. I'll still use it because I have some 32-bit apps like QuickTime 7 and MPEG Stream Clip or whatever that I need to use it on an occasion that won't
Hmm.
run on the new Mac OS. But this machine is stupidly quick, and I can't describe it more than thinking like I was at like the rental car place and they gave me like a souped up car when I just asked for a minivan.
Hmm.
Like I feel like it's something that I shouldn't have the power to access because it's very zippy. I only ran into a few minor things with Final Cut Pro, and I just turned off background rendering, and that seemed to do it. But on my other machine, since it was unsupported, I was using graphics that weren't shipped by it and all this stuff. When I would export a video, sometimes I get weird compression artifacts. I'd have to watch the video to see it, to see if anything was going on. So that was like a tiring process. And then you drag a clip into the Final Cut Pro timeline, and it would just like chug and all this stuff. And
Hmm.
on this, I was playing around with an old project, a 32-minute project, my first part of the Macintosh clones documentary I'm doing, and that's a 32-minute 4K video file. It rendered the whole thing and exported it in 8 minutes and 50 seconds. So I'm like, oh my gosh! Like I used to have to like literally plan my day around when I was going to export this because
Yeah.
I couldn't do much on the computer,
Right.
while it was doing that, and I'd hear the hard drive chugging away and all this stuff. I mean, so I was very hesitant to not buy the first revision of an M1 Mac when the Mac Mini came out because I was so close, Stephen, to getting that. I was like, look, even if I get the base model, it'll be okay, but then that's 8 gigs of RAM and all this stuff. And even when I was purchasing this one, I'm doing the payment plan on it. I can't afford buying it outright, but I'm like, all right, 32 gigs versus 64. And I'm looking at my Mac Pro, which had 38 gigs, and I'm like, well, apparently these machines are much more efficient. And read a lot of stuff and looked at a lot of videos
Right.
of people, and I'm like, I think 32 gigs will be enough for me, which is weird because I have to sort of rethink how the machine's architecture is because I'm so used to
Yeah.
Intel.
Yeah.
And it's just so efficient. I mean, I'm sitting here now. If I talk to you, I'm going to Activity Monitor now, and it looks like I'm barely using anything. 7% of my system resources, and 10 gigs of memory.
Yeah.
But everything is so quick. The SSD is so quick. The memory compression is very fast. I think it's very refreshing to have. Obviously, when you get a new computer, it's very quick, but it's very
Hmm.
refreshing to know that this is the future of Apple systems, that they're all going to be using this architecture. I think it's great for the OS. I like the nice to haves of running select iOS apps on the
Hmm.
machine and things like
Definitely.
that. I'm not used to all this fancy stuff. I really am not. I'm used to Mojave. I am still trying to get used to bits of the OS. So it's like a night and day experience for me. But I think that
Yeah.
the future of Apple's desktops is very bright, which is good because I know about you, but I was concerned for a little while with
Yeah.
everything with the iOS and stuff like that, and that was like the focus. And then it was like the Mac sort of took a back burner position for a
Yeah.
while.
Yeah, we talked a bit about that on this week's episode of Connected because it's been 5 years since the Mac Roundtable. And I just went through the list and I realized that 5 years ago, there was no good Mac. Like the bad Mac Mini with no upgradable RAM was for sale.
Oh gosh.
There had not been an iMac update in 2 years. We had butterfly keyboards and touch bars. Like it was amazing to go through the list and be like, oh, they really were not where they needed to be.
Yeah. And that was
yeah,
scary because it's like
it was.
I love the operating system. Yes, the hardware is nice, but Mac OS 10 and I still call it Mac OS 10, but the Mac OS and I are in sync. I understand how it works. I could drag things around and drop files into here and there, and I like it. And what was the scariest for me is like, oh my goodness, what if there's an Apple piece of hardware that I don't want to buy to run the Mac OS on? Like that's a crossroads for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thankfully they've walked back from the brink, I think, with Mac hardware.
Yeah.
All right, I've got 4 quick questions for you.
Sure.
So I want to hear about your favorite and least favorite classic Mac, and I'll let you define classic however you want.
All right, that's an excellent question. My favorite classic Mac, I'll go with the 68K era first. The Quadra 840 AV.
Good choice.
Picked it up at a yard sale for $5. It's currently the bane of my existence because it no longer wants to work. It's a lovely machine. I'm a sucker for audiovisual in and out. So just having that capability, plugging that thing into a TV when I was in high school was like, so cool.
Yeah.
Probably my least favorite it's hard to pick a least favorite. Probably the Macintosh TV. And I think it's a lovely product. I have one. I have the keyboard and the mouse with it.
Yeah. But mine's right over here.
The decisions made with it, the 8 megabyte memory ceiling, and just like the silly things of that. I mean, I heard a Apple anecdote that they didn't even think they would ship them. So why bother painting the caddy door black?
Yeah. There's beige in there when you open it, which is real depressing.
Exactly. People contacted me before and said, I think I have one, but somebody broke off the CD tray because I see beige. I'm like, no, that's just how it is.
That's how it was. Yeah, it was a compromised Mac to begin with.
Yeah.
And the TV stuff wasn't integrated at all. Like very fundamentally broken product.
Yeah, you could take snapshots, not even live video clips. I almost said the Macintosh LC because the LC was one of those until the LC3, it was really a 16-bit bus with a 32-bit processor. I mean, come on. But anything along those lines, I think, unfortunately, do not. I still will use them. They're not the happiest Macs that I consider.
Yeah. So let's switch to software then. Do you have a favorite or sort of version of Mac OS that you're most fond of? And then do you have a version that makes your hair on your neck stand up?
I have to say System 7.6 and macOS 8.6 are probably my 2 standbys. That's what I remember most playing around on any flavor of System 7, really. They're all pretty good. But 8.6, I think, is very solid. If you're going to go macOS 10, Tiger is an absolute rock solid system. I'm so glad that was the transition to Intel during that OS, because you have so many apps that would still run on PowerPC versions of Tiger, and then they updated it and you could run it on the Intel ones too.
And Tiger was the transition OS, and it was also the version of OS 10 that was out the longest, because Leopard, if you remember, they showed Leopard off 2 WWDCs in a row, and then we've taken people from Mac OS 10 to go work on the iPhone. Leopard will be out later.
I remember that.
I've told the story before, but I was actually on campus for my Mac Genius training when Leopard came out. And so I went to the beer bash for Leopard.
Oh, cool.
I remember seeing Leopard because at that time, it's different now, obviously, with public betas and stuff. But back then, running a beta version of Mac OS 10 wasn't that easy to come by.
Oh, yeah.
And I think Snow Leopard was the first beta I ran, and that was only because I was running an Apple authorized service provider, so I had access to it all. But I remember seeing Leopard on that 2007 aluminum and black iMac and thinking, this is why this computer looks this way, because this is how Leopard looks. And, Tiger fit in with the white plastic clear acrylic thing. But yeah, man, Tiger was... it was so good and so good for so long.
Yeah, I think 10.6 would be my next favorite because Snow Leopard is a solid system.
Yeah, you're legally obligated to answer Snow Leopard.
Yeah, Snow Leopard. is great. I mean, I think it sort of went off the rails with 10.7 Lion and 10.8. Mountain Lion was sort of like a bug fix and a band-aid for Lion.
Super, yeah. I totally agree. They changed the document model. They had
Yeah.
all the weird UI stuff. Like
They took away the
Lion
color
was
from the
weird.
sidebar. Like, come on.
Yeah, Lion was weird.
Yeah, those are both weird. Mavericks 10.9 was very solid. I think LCAP was too, but it was one of those things where I stuck to the OS. I had such a bad experience with Lion and Mountain Lion. Then
Hmm.
10.6, I stuck to that until I was forced to upgrade with my new machine to 10.9, and I stuck on that for ages because I was like,
Yeah.
I don't want to break anything. My scanner works, my printer works, I'm good. But I just want to touch on something very briefly. You mentioned the macOS betas were very hard to come by and such like that. And yeah, they were. It still blows my mind, Stephen, today that there are these like, you know, young guys walking around with the latest, version of iOS beta on their iPhone, being like, yeah, it's on my main device, it's fine. And it's just like me wrapping my head around that. I'm like, wait a second, like that's a beta, don't you?
Yeah.
Isn't your phone mission critical to you? But again, it's a different time. Everything's iCloud backed up and this and that. So I guess it's
Yeah.
not that bad. But still, it's like me. It's like I have a bad experience from the gold master version of Tiger coming out and it wiping my iDisk clean because it had that new
Oh.
iDisk syncing functionality. And I actually had to call up Apple and go up the tiers of support, and somehow they got it back. But it was like one of those things where I'm a bit reserved sometimes when it comes to new software. Let
Yeah.
someone else update it for a while and tell me how it goes, and I'll jump right in after.
Yeah. I remember running an iOS probably version 4. No, it was version 5, iOS 5, because I wanted notification center and stuff. And
Okay.
running that and going to answer the phone one day, and you slide to answer, and I let my thumb off the screen, the phone rebooted. I was like, well, it's not great.
If it's
But
important, they'll leave a voicemail.
I guess so. Um,
Yeah, I
uh,
think I think System 6 was the first system I ever saw. I'm reading that in the chat. Was the first system I ever used on our Mac 2CX. But I have more fond memories of System 7 because that's when I think I was playing around with the machine on my own. But yeah.
yeah. And 7, I think, was friendlier in a lot of ways. And if you had a Mac that could run color, it was very exciting there. It's the System
Oh
7
yeah,
days. Well, Steve, thanks for joining me, man. Let
of
people
course.
know where they can find you and how to subscribe.
Sure. So I'm on Mac84 on YouTube. So if you do a search for Mac84, you'll come up with me. I'm almost at 10,000 subscribers. Maybe we'll be pushed over by the end of the show. I'm on Twitter and Instagram. My handle is Mac84TV. I'm also on Patreon. Just search for Mac84 there. Or if you go to Mac84.net, that's my website. All the stuff is there. And you could find out how to get in touch with me, or if you want to send something in for repair, or just watch crazy long live streams and put yourself to sleep. That's fine with me.
Well, thanks for joining me, and we'll talk soon.
Great. It's been a pleasure. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.